Welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today we're going to be making block 2 in the Kaleidoscope Block of the Month. This is the official block of the month of Northcott fabrics for 2017. It features Stonehenge Gradations. These are really just beautiful fabrics, and you can get them at your local quilt shop that carries Northcott, as well as at quiltaddictsanonymous.com. And there is a pattern book to go with this as well, so make sure you pick one up at your local quilt shop or again at Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Let's get started. So we did strip piecing last time, so I'm just going to go through the instructions really quick this time. What you're going to do is you're going to lay your strips right sides together, and you're going to sew them with your sewing machine. I like to use a scant 1/4 inch stitch. It helps me with accuracy, but you can use a regular 1/4 inch stitch as well. Once you finish sewing your strips together, you're going to press them open with the fabric seam going underneath the dark side of the fabric. In this case, it's that black fabric. Then you're going to cut them up into 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles, and this saves time because rather than cutting out those tiny little squares and sewing them together, you can sew them as strips and then cut, and it really saves a ton of time and makes it really efficient. Now we're going to sew these together into 4 patches. We're going to bring them back over to the sewing machine and just put them through. At this point I use a regular 1/4 inch stitch. Then you're going to want to press them open, and it really doesn't matter which side the seam goes under at this point. We're making 4 patches in 2 different colorways. Make sure you refer to your instructions in your pattern book so that way you know which fabrics to use where to make those 4 patches. Alright, we have 2 new units that we're going to be using in this month's block, so I'm going to show you how to do that. First up, we have a double pinwheel unit, and this one you have to cut 2 1/4 square triangles and 1/2 square triangle. So they're not going to look like they're the same size at this stage, and that's because we have some seam allowances that need to fit into that. So don't worry if it looks like it won't go together. It will once we have those seam allowances in there. So I'm going to go ahead and set my sewing machine to a scant 1/4 inch stitch for this. I always like to sew with a scant 1/4 inch stitch when I'm doing triangles, because that allows me to have a little bit of room to trim it down later, so that way I can have a perfectly accurate piece when it's done. So make sure you refer to your pattern book so you know that you have your fabrics in the right spots. And then you can go ahead and start with these 1/4 square triangles by laying them right sides together. And now I'm going to bring them over to my sewing machine. My threads arranged there. And I'm just going to go ahead and sew down this piece. And we did a little bit of chain piecing last month. You certainly could do that with these as well. We have 8 blocks to make, and there are 3 of these in each block, so that is quite a few of these you need to make. So you certainly could chain piece these to save time and thread. For the purpose of the video, I'm just doing one, so that's why I'm not doing that here. Now in this case, I'm going to actually press the seam open. I find that it lays a lot flatter, and it makes the block construction a lot easier in the end if I just go ahead and press that seam open rather than from one side to the other. Whenever I'm pressing a seam open, I press it from the back first, and then I just give it one more press from the front, and that helps it lay nice and flat. Now before I bring anything back over to the sewing machine, I always like to lay it back in place to make sure everything is still in the right spot. So now I'm going to lay these right sides together, and one thing to note is when I do my math for my triangles, I like to leave a little extra space in the 1/2 square triangle, and again that allows me to be able to trim a little bit away and have a perfectly accurate piece. So your black triangle is going to be a little bit bigger than the one you just pieced together, and that's okay. That means you're doing it right. So you can pin this together if you like. I'm not going to. I'm just going to start sewing. So I still have my sewing machine set up to sew that scant 1/4 inch stitch. Again, I really like to trim away rather than not have enough. And usually it's like just barely trimming away anything to get that all squared up. So I find that having that little extra space really helps with accuracy when you're sewing triangles. Alright, it's time to press this guy open again. And pretty much every time we do triangles, unless it's on the picket fence units, I'm going to advise you to press every seam open, because it really just helps them lay nice and flat and makes putting the block and the quilt top eventually together a lot easier. Alright, now the key to getting really accurate triangle units is trimming. So I'm going to show you my techniques for trimming that help me get really accurate points. So what I do is I'm going to trim this down to 4.5 inches, and you can see that I really don't have too much outside of this area, but it's still really important to give that a trim. So a couple things I'm looking for is I have my 45-degree line along the seam line between the two triangles. Then I'm also making sure that where my 4.5 inch dotted line meets the edge, that's right at the point where these two quarter square triangles come together. And the same thing up here. I want to make sure that my 45-degree line is right on that seam line all the way to the points. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim that, the side and the top. And this side we really didn't trim too much off. We got a little bit more on the top. But even though we didn't take too much off, it really does make a big, big difference. So now this time, I'm making sure that the edge I just cut is right even with that dotted line for 4.5 inches. So I've got a little bit hanging off here, which is good. We're going to cut that off. My 45-degree line is still along that seam line and comes out right where that point is, so that's good. And now I'm checking to make sure that the point of these quarter square triangles is right at where that dotted line meets the edge of the ruler. And so everything is where it should be. And if it isn't, you can give it a little bit of a tug to get it where it's supposed to be. So now I've trimmed off, and you can see there isn't too much left over here, so that's good. But we now have a perfectly square double pinwheel unit that's going to go together perfectly when we put this block together, and you're not going to lose any of those precious triangle tips. So isn't that a pretty easy way to make your double pinwheel unit? No fuss, and those triangle points end up perfect. Now we're going to do something really similar to make our hourglass units. So for this one, we're going to be starting off with squares. So we're actually going to sew our seams before we cut it apart into triangles. This is really great, especially if you're a beginner sewer, because you actually are sewing on the bias while it's still tethered to something else. So that makes it much less likely to stretch, which can be a problem if you're sewing on the bias. And it will help you make even more accurate triangle units. So we're going to start this method now. So I'm going to go ahead and set my black squares to the side, and I'm going to take my purple squares and flip them over. Now I'm going to take my ruler, and I'm going to line it up from point to point on the back side of these. Then I'm going to take my marking tool, and I'm going to mark along that edge. And we have a good strong line here. Now, I went over that several times so that it would show up on camera. You don't have to be that zealous when you're marking your line. You could just use a little number 2 pencil. Mechanical pencils work great. Just enough so that you can see it is perfectly fine. So now this is a couple step process to do this. So what you want to do is you want to lay these right sides together with the black. And to make sure, these purples are all really close, so to make sure you've got the right one, make sure that you refer to your pattern book, which you can get at your local quilt shop that stocks Northcott fabrics, or from quiltaddictsanonymous.com. And we're going to take these over to the sewing machine now. So if you want, you can pin these. You certainly don't have to. I'm a big fan of not pinning if you don't have to. And you'll see that as you follow along with these tutorials. So I still have my sewing machine set up to sew that scant 1/4 inch stitch. That's so I will have a little bit to trim off at the end. And what I'm doing is I'm just sewing with my presser foot right next to this line that we drew. Again, I'm going to sew all the way down one side. And again, this is something you can chain piece. So you can just do a whole line of these to get all the ones you need done. You don't need too many for this block for this time, but if you have a bunch of these that you want to make for another quilt, this is a really great project to chain piece. Alright, so I've sewed all the way down. I don't even need to break my thread. You can just kind of pull that out of the way. Get it set up to start going. And now I'm going to sew down the other side Again, with this, press your foot right on top of that drawn line. It's right next to it. I can see it right next to that presser foot. So now we need to take these and we need to cut them apart on the drawn line. I use my rotary cutter for this step. And it's not super important that you have an exact 1/4 inch seam at this point, because we already have that accuracy when we sewed next to that drawn line. But you don't want to get too skinny on either side either, because if you have this long armed and you have a really skinny seam, it can pop open when it is on that frame. So do be careful of that. Now, hourglass units are one triangle unit that I will press where the seam goes to the dark side. And the reason is, when we do the next section, those seams are going to butt up next to each other and make our job really easy when we're getting this next part together. So I'm going to go ahead and press all of these so that the seam is underneath the dark side, and then we'll be doing our next step. So now we need to take half of the ones that we just sewed, and we're going to flip them so that the back side is facing up, and we're going to draw a line from point to point on these as well. And you may need to use 2 separate marking tools to do this so that the line shows up really clearly, because that purple won't necessarily show up on that black. So I have my chalk marking tool for this black, so it's pink, and up top I have that purple one so that I can see everything really clearly. Now I'm going to lay this right sides together with one from the opposite. So you can see this purple's a little darker than this one. Again, to make sure you have the right ones, make sure you get your pattern book from quiltaddictsanonymous.com or your local quilt shop that carries Northcott fabrics. They can order them as well. So what you're going to do is you're going to line this up so that these seams butt up next to each other. And you'll be able to feel it. When you put your finger here, you should feel that those seams are right next to each other. You shouldn't feel a bump. That means they're on top of each other, or a gap. That means they're too far apart. But a nice way to check is to just put your thumb right where that center line is and pull it back. And if everything is meeting where it's supposed to be, then you're good to go. You don't need to worry about anything slipping on you. Now, if this is the first time you've done this method, I do suggest sticking a pin in right in that seam line and right through that center, and that'll help keep everything in line until you can sew it. If you've done this a while, you can skip this part because you'll just get used to putting it where it's supposed to go. Now we're just sewing the scant 1/4 inch seam again, and we're going to sew down both sides of that drawn line. I slow down once I get to that seam allowance, and once my needle is in there and in a needle down position, that's when I remove my pin. And then I'm going to make sure that these points line up at the back and sew the rest of the way. Now, just like before, we want to sew down the other side of this drawn line as well. And you can chain piece these as well if you like. I usually slow down just a little bit when I get to that center, just to make sure everything goes all right. So we really want those points to look good. So now we're going to cut this apart on the drawn line. And then when you open up, we have some 1/4 square triangles, also called hourglass units. And our points are exactly where they should be, in the center. And I bet you they're going to square up great as well, because there will be no stretching on the bias, or at least very little, because we sewed those together while they were still a square. You're going to get 4 of these for every 4 big squares that you use to make it. So it also is a big time saver. It really doesn't matter what side you press that seam under, just that you do it. And you do want to make sure you don't press in any pleats. Sometimes that's easy to do in these corners. So just make sure that it's good and flat and you don't have any pleats where these fabrics come together. We have one last step before this is ready to go in the quilt. We've got to square it up. Now, there probably isn't going to be much to square up at all. In this case, it's pretty right on, because the math is right on for these. but it is still good to do it and make sure you have all your points where they should be. So in this case, I'm still making sure that my 45-degree line is traveling pretty much on that seam line, and that it's coming out right where these triangles meet. And then I'm going to give this a little bit of a tug. I'm a little shy here, but as long as you're not more than 1/8 of an inch off, it's going to be all right. So I've got everything where I want it to be. I'm going to go ahead and trim that. I'm really just getting the dog ears off at this point for this one. Some of them you'll get a little bit more off, others not as much. So now I've got it turned around, and I have the edges I just cut around the 4.5 inch line. And my 45-degree line is still on here. And you can see here that I'm actually a little shy up here. But again, I'm not more than 1/8 of an inch off. So in the grand scheme of things, this is a big quilt that's not going to make that much of a difference. So it'll be okay. If it was any more than that, then you may want to consider redoing this. And if you do that, then maybe cut them to 5.5 inches instead of 5.25. And that way you definitely have some room to trim down. Alright, so I've got this trimmed up, and now it's ready to put into a block. Now we've really covered in a lot of detail how to put the block together once it's essentially a 9-patch and we have all these units together. So I'm not going to go over the specifics of how to get the block from 9 separate units into one block. If you need a refresher on that, please watch the end of block 1's video tutorial. It goes in great detail on that. But I will quickly say that what you want to do is you want to sew it together in rows, and then you're going to sew your rows together to make your final block. I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera, and then we'll show you what it looks like. So here's what block 2 looks like when it's all together. It really is pretty simple when you break it down into piece by piece. And thank you so much for following along. Whether you're buying your fabric from your local quilt shop or from me over at Quilt Addicts Anonymous, thank you so much for helping to support my patterns, and then also Northcott's beautiful fabrics. These Stonehenge Gradations are just beautiful. So again, if you want to get the pattern for this, go check out your local quilt shop that carries Northcott fabrics. They can get it, or you can get it at quiltaddictsanonymous.com. Thanks so much for following, and stay tuned for the instructions for block 3.